What's up, guys? Welcome to another edition of Before the Whistle, presented by BRK Insurance Group. If your business is looking for the best in employee benefits, commercial property and casualty insurance, or retirement and 401k plan services, there's no one better suited to meet your challenges and build a plan centered around your needs than BRK Insurance Group. What's going on, y'all? Welcome again back to Before the Whistle, back to my regularly scheduled format here with my episodes coming out, albeit on Wednesday and Friday throughout spring camp, as I've said, just kind of due to Tulane's football schedule. So we had pro day last week. I recapped that in last week's episode, took that day off just because it was a very long day, to be honest with you. And I just wanted some time to marinate on what can initially seem like a very lackluster day, unless you're kind of a nerd that is really into drills and times and things like that. And then the football team was on spring break for the last week and then 10 days or so. So today, Tuesday, I can speak fine today. Tuesday was the first time that we really got to see them back. And I was curious to see what the build on would be from what I believe our first impressions of this new squad were. That being said, those first impressions, I was something that stuck out to me in one of Jon Sumrall's comments today about how you don't get a second chance to make a first impression. And there goes my microphone. It's this kind of episode I see. In terms of what he's really looking out to get out of his team, what he's looking to instill as a coach and those values, and just talking about that first impression, we're still, I think, really gathering a sense of that, at least in terms of what you can project to see as those starting guys on the field come training camp, let alone, or fall camp, let alone the start of next season. I mean, going through the roster, it stuck out how many guys aren't here anymore. And I know that seems like a given and obvious at this point, but I went back a step further. I was just standing there at practice today, and I was very curious about how many guys are still here from the 2021 year, just because when I'm thinking about, how do you build an identity? Where do you really start over from that? Do we still consider what that identity of these last couple of years for Tulane on this new team, despite the fact that really there aren't that many holdovers in terms of familiar faces? Now, that being said, there are quite a few guys who've actually been around a little longer than I thought, but those are either quieter guys, not starters, or perhaps not leaders. Either way, you definitely are kind of looking for, I think, a vocal leader at this point on both sides of the ball, as well as some answers at some of the positions. But what I've also been evaluating in tandem with that is my first impressions of how this new coaching staff handles things, how they go about spring camp. And hindsight's 2020. I didn't realize that last year's training camp for spring camp with Willie Fritz would be the last one with him. And so you don't necessarily take that much notice of those things at the time. It's something I'm just bearing in mind, especially in this age of college football, that you really just never know how much time you have left around a team, a person, an organization, what have you. All that to say, I can kind of think back and think about the intensity of what spring practices felt like under Willie Fritz, and fall camp for that matter, as well as practices throughout the season. But spring camp is just a little different. It's a lot of installs. It's a lot more just getting the team, all of the base parts working and building the foundation before adding any layers to the cake, what have you, which is what I think happens in fall camp. Except for the last couple of years, quarterback has been a given, at least as long as I've been the sideline reporter. And there have been so many defensive holdovers from one year to another. But this year, it really just stuck out how vacant it is. But I think with the lack of familiarity with the team, it's really just kind of forced me to take a very step back, first impressions perspective of what the team looks like, what this new coaching staff has really moved like. And while I don't have necessarily a play-by-play of what exactly went down in today's practice, I think you can still see how much there is to learn on just a daily basis about this team through this next stint of spring camp, if you will. This is probably an unnecessary over-explain, a memoir, but just to put this on the record, I really don't intend any of this to be a comparison of Willie Fritz versus Jon Sumrall moving forward. And I don't really think anyone is thinking that way per se, but it really has just kind of struck me that there have been so many palpable differences that I can feel in spring camp already. Again, just to put context in the basis of things, I came in as a sideline reporter in the 2021 year. Willie Fritz had been the head coach of Tulane since 2016, had been a head coach at all of his previous stints, that everyone that follows his team knows Willie's storied history. All that to say, it was a established culture, an established goal, mentality, what have you. And even though that year did not go as planned whatsoever, as people know by now, it was all but an anomaly, one that was really affected by a lot of situational factors. But a lot of those guys were the exact same guys that ended up winning the Cotton Bowl just a year later. They only had, I think, one major guy enter the transfer portal in Jeffrey Johnson after that 2-10 year. And I immediately, after a season full of losing, could sense what culture and a really good head coach felt like. I remember really getting that feeling the most in the penultimate game of the season. It was the final home game. It was against USF in the 2021 year. It was the week after the Tulsa overtime homecoming loss that really just felt like the final nail in the demoralizing coffin of that year. And you could just really feel the emotions kind of run high during that game. And I've said before, that was one of those games where I had to remind myself to step back, but it was my 5-year homecoming as an alumni and first year as a sideline reporter. And you just felt that frustration boil over. And you've won one game all year. You're not going to the postseason. All you're playing for at that point is pride. And I don't think there are any guys that mail it in, but I do think you can't find a roster full of guys that are as all in as the guys that walked out in that second to last game of the year against USF. I don't remember the exact score, but it was such an overwhelming victory that I am inclined to look it up and see if it comes up really quickly, which would be grand. It did. 45-14. This was a team that offensively really had struggled all season long. Defensively, I remember at one point Willie said, I don't know if the guys know if they're playing offense or defense. And we all looked at each other as that being a very bad sign to hear from a head coach in a post-game comment after one of those losses. So to be able to all throw that aside, to still focus, and yeah, we don't use the 1-0 mentality any longer, but there was a reason that it became such a mantra. There is something to be said psychologically about having that little cue, that little mantra that it just reminds you of a mindset. It's short, it's concise, it's one that is a universal consensus language between a team. It's one that can be said quickly in a chant. And I don't know what they're going to end up chanting this year. I don't know what their identity is going to be this upcoming year. But that game to me back in 2021 showed this real 1-0 mentality and grit of that team that you saw eventually win the Cotton Bowl. Last year, there was a lot of guys that were lost to the NFL draft. Tajay Spears, Dorian Williams, and just all of the seniors that moved on that were key starters on offense and defense. And yet it really didn't feel like there had to be that much maintenance done because Michael Pratt was still there. The offense was still generally under the same hand. You can go back and forth on what the OC situation was really of the 22 year, but in title, calling plays, what have you, Slade Nagel was still the longest tenured head coach tenured coach he'd been around since Willie Fritz took the job in 2016. So there is so much continuity in that aspect. On the offensive side of the ball, yeah, you lost the entire middle of the field defensively speaking, but you had a lot of depth that ended up really working out for Tulane. But I do remember not really knowing that much about what Jesus Machado and Corey Platt were going to look like because we'd only really seen them in limited stretches up to that point or in 4-3 base set. Usually I believe Corey Platt was the one coming in for that. But, save for those rotations here and there, you didn't know that much about them. And Dorian and Nick were really the heart and soul of that defense, not to mention the leading and co-leading tacklers, and did not miss any time, if any, really, in that 2022 year. I know Nick Anderson missed some time the season prior, but you lose all of them. You lose all those secondary guys, but you still had your starting cornerbacks essentially in Lance Robinson and Jarius Monroe. So yeah, you had to replace your starting safeties, but you had Bailey Despaney and DJ Douglas on the roster. At the same time, throughout spring, I'm thinking back, someone that immediately caught my eye in spring camp that you could just tell was a step above was Andre Sam. And that really clearly ended up working out for him. He's probably going to get drafted very high after going on to LSU after, leaving Tulane spring camp. But I also immediately felt the impact that Cam Pettislow brought when he came later on in that fall period. But trying to evaluate the quarterback or the running back competition last year, for example, we all kept saying we don't know. And no one was saying Makai Hughes because you just can't simulate game settings enough to be able to tell, at least from our perspective. And there's a reason that I am in the broadcast booth and I'm not a coach, that we are not the coaches of the team, because, obviously our eye check is a lot different from the evaluation of the coaching staff. And something that I will just say has stuck out about Jon Sumrall's approach is just how open and candid he really is with it. Almost kind of seems like just his not stream of consciousness, because it's well thought out and articulate, but we really just get this glean into his thought process. My whole spiel for saying I don't really want to compare and contrast them is because I don't think that it really does any value to say, but it's also really, to me, just completely different circumstantially speaking. Willie Fritz had established a culture. He had established a mentality here. He had a vision that he was able to recruit guys and see them go on from one year to another. And so by year 3 of this, it just really felt like all of those guys had grown up, but you really just didn't have that many question marks. And so it wasn't really necessarily that investigatory heading into spring camp. So I didn't necessarily chart down, like I said, what the drills looked like back then. And you just compare, Jon Sumrall, he's a younger guy. It's his second stint as a head coach, but he was the head coach at Troy for 2 years before coming over to Tulane. Willie Fritz had decades of coaching experience before he ended up over at Tulane. So you really have to come in quickly, especially in this era of college football. Willie Fritz came in, and a program builder is that slow burn, and that's what Tulane needed at that time. But it has been built. Now you have to really take it a step higher and just keep that punch up. But you don't have any of the guys really from this last season to instill that in. So where does it come from? Obviously, it comes, from the coaching staff. There are players that have to step up, but do the anecdotes carry over? It's just something that has been very fascinating to me. And so all that to say, I'm very much hyper focused on this new coaching staff. And so moving forward, it's really just what's impressed me about them, because my detective hat has just been on from day one in a way that really never felt like it had to be under Willie Fritz. Because the first year, to be honest, I was just trying to figure out who was on the field. And you do get used to it a few years in. For any younger people out there, the names come a lot quicker, even despite all the turnover in today's age. And I say that, and there'll probably be several guys that change their number. But I will stop this long rant at this point and get back to really, the Tulane of now. It's going to be hard for me to stop talking about the Tulane prior, if nothing else, just for a barometer where, again, I don't know that much about how Troy did. I could look more into them, but I'm really just basing this all off of what my impressions are here and what I can see on a day-to-day basis. So, today I didn't necessarily take as much time charting things. Honestly, it was the first day that me, Corey, and Steve have really all kind of been there at the same time at the start of practice and really had a chance to just kind of catch up and talk. But it struck me just how many times we were standing amongst the media and the intensity was brought up. Talking about the fact that it just feels like the tempo is really just fast paced, and the gas pedal is starting a lot earlier on in the day. It caught everyone's eye at one point where I looked at my phone because it was only 9:06 and the team was coming together in the middle of the field. And Jon Sumrall just kind of called a halt, essentially. That was something that we didn't really see that often under Willie Fritz. Again, there are different pressures here. It's something that Jon Sumrall was very candid about after practice, talking about the fact that, he sets really high standards for himself. He feels like he wants to be at X point and wants more physicality, wants more toughness from these guys. And maybe that standard is a little too high, but you don't really have that much time to figure things out. And if you're trying to push for the college football playoffs this year, you don't have a starting quarterback at this point. You can surmise, again, how things are kind of going. Ty Thompson got the first team reps today. He threw an interception. Kai Horton went in for him. I'm still just kind of waiting for that day where it all really sticks out for one of the other. I will say, though, that I'm kind of waiting for this upcoming Saturday's practice in order to get a really good sense of that, because that's going to be where, they're going to run, and I'll go on my notes here, because just very open by this new coaching staff where, Thursday is going to be a little bit shorter of a practice, because something that also stuck out to everyone today was that they were in, full pads. They had game day pants on. And I asked Lawrence Keys at one point, if that was something, because those guys are all there afterwards to keep their training up, even though the pro day is over, their draft prep still doesn't stop. And yeah, there were times where they practiced in shells, but he did say that it did seem very intense out there, and it just really sucked for the guys that miss football and have spent their whole lives going 110%. And then, for them, they're also at the same time excited to kind of follow along. They're all hanging out at practice. And that's not to say that they're doing that because they have nothing better to do. They're all there to train thereafter, but they don't know this new coaching staff. There really aren't a ton of guys left over from the last couple of years, but these guys still want to be around this program. And I just think that says so much both about Tulane's legacy of the old and what Jon Sumrall is already able to produce and put on the field and get things really going and get this sense of momentum. And you can tell just how much of a difference that makes for us to be able to ascertain these differences between these two different coaching staffs when we've seen probably as many team drill periods that we would have seen throughout the first couple of weeks of spring camp. And again, maybe this is just a different way of doing things, but sometimes when you're lacking leaders, it's something he keeps pointing out. He's not shy about the fact that they're still kind of looking for that edge rusher guy, probably an offensive tackle, and honestly was a little candid about the youth in the secondary and wanting probably another guy in addition to, I'm assuming he was referring to Micah Robinson, one of the cornerbacks they picked up in the transfer portal quite recently, but there aren't a ton of loud leaders out there yet. You're missing Michael Pratt. That much is palpable. But when it's a quarterback competition, it's hard to really expect those guys to try to focus on learning the playbook. They're all under a new system. Everyone that's on this field is in a new situation, save for probably the guys in the secondary who have a lot of stability with JJ McCleskey and Rob Green still being around from the last couple of years. But everyone just has to learn things from a different perspective all around. But the guys that have come in, at this point, just to be upfront, as a podcaster with ADHD and a poor working memory, I should probably stop getting surprised when I lose my train of thought and stop fighting it so much and just it's not going to come back all the time. All that to say, I lost my train of thought. It came back. Here we are talking about what I'm able to look at from the quarterbacks and what you can really expect from them in a quarterback competition. They're all trying to learn the playbook. As I was saying, that applies to every single guy on the field, but it's a new offensive system. And it's both guys that have never been in a starting role before. You have one guy that I think I walked into the press conference room because I was talking with Lawrence Keys as Jon Sumrall was talking about him. I want to say that's who he was referring to when he said that he's about 80 to 90%. And he said today that he feels fully healthy. He really talked a lot more like you kind of want out of that starting quarterback from what I can remember the first time seeing him. And it was just before spring camp started. And as I said, then it just strikes me how young these guys are and that they don't really know us that well at this point. But that was a noticeable jump that I saw from him. But to expect them to do all of that on the field where, Kai Horton probably has a little of the edge there in that he knows some of these guys well, but they're used to Michael Pratt ultimately being that leader at quarterback. And when you're trying to learn the playbook, it's a lot to balance. If you guys saw my interview that I did with Jarius Monroe, one of the cornerbacks for Tulane that departed from last year, I keep coming back to his sentiment of learning to lead while being a leader in that same moment, where he didn't really know all the ins and outs of leadership, but he really appreciated that Tulane gave him the space to allow himself to work those kinks out in real time while still looking to him as a leader. To me, that's a really tall ask when you then add on the component of you are battling for a starting position, whereas Jarius Monroe going into this last year was the starter at his role. So I'm kind of just waiting for us to really see some plays to get any type of sense of who might be pulling away from that. But I've learned my lesson with the Saints quarterback competition as well, that it is ugly often on a daily basis. It's not to infer anything about today. It's more of my memories from the last competition and trying to say that one horse is ahead of the race that regularly is just going to be a losing battle. So I'm going to wait and see what we really see on Saturday, where when I talk about the candidness and just the amount that we get from this new coaching staff, you probably said that we'll see them, they're finally going to just run plays, do like I said, just play some football. Said north of 50, probably not 100 plays if they're healthy. As a team, after they do their full injury check on Thursdays, which I'm assuming is something new that they've implemented, or just something that we're getting more public information about, depending on how that goes this upcoming Thursday, more like 50 to 60 or 70 to 80. And then really walking us through what that's going to look like. That, initially they'll start with a little bit of those specialty periods and individual periods, and sometime between 10:30 and 10:45 is when they'll put the ball down and play. And that, then I practice starts at 10. So, I'm assuming they'll go for an hour 15, but we've seen them extend drives. And you think about the gauntlet, it wasn't something that I was at or really know that much about. But if you watch the Welcome to Uptown thing for Tulane, you saw it was this conditioning nightmare, it seemed like, put on by the strength and conditioning coach, Rusty Witt. Very valuable in that they were trying to simulate fatigue in games and not making those mental errors. And they had to keep doing it until they beat it. That really probably gets tough at day 5, because it was day 6 when they finally beat kind of doing the same thing over again. But I think these guys really need to believe it in themselves and see it in themselves. And I think to an extent, they do kind of need to just put the ball down and play. And yes, we've seen a lot of these periods throughout just however many practices. I believe there was a week, if not 2 weeks of spring camp, but I believe it was only just that 1 week. And so it's really crazy to say in just 4, 5, 6 practices. I will get that information for when I have my head screwed on a little more straight this next episode. But have all of this insight already where, it's just really me going off of observations and these kind of press conferences. We really haven't even started doing any type of individualized chats with Jon Sumrall. This is just how open and honest he really is with the media, and I just think it really helps Tulane so much. He engages the media. He really, again, details just a lot about the way he thinks, and that really drums up the interest that is really needed at this point. There is a lot of momentum swirling around for Tulane, but if you ask the people that have gone to practice, it seems like it's been really intense. Every time we hear from Jon Sumrall on Tuesdays and Thursdays, he is disappointed with the intensity. Maybe he is just chasing this elusive intensity dream. But why not think that that's achievable? That's essentially the whole thing with that gauntlet, is you have to really find it within yourselves. And so he feels like that's lacking. Feels like sometimes they're a little bit sluggish. He did point out today that it was a little bit warmer, but you do miss the guys that you think would kind of just kick some asses into gear at this point. You think about Nick Anderson, Dorian Williams, and Michael Pratt for that matter. I mean, and it's not to say that there's been slacking or that there haven't been leaders, but it really just given me an appreciation for how important leadership really is, and how much you can't just really place it on the next guy wearing the jersey and say, okay, well, he's the starter now, so make him be the leader. Some people have very different styles of leadership. That is probably undervalued more than anything else. And some guys are just really not that comfortable with it. Some guys are really trying to figure out what their space is on this team. But you're going to need guys to start stepping up once the ball actually starts to snap, once these guys start to hit. Now, that being said, we've seen quite a bit of hitting in practice, especially against the running backs and these linebackers. But ultimately, it just goes to show, I thought that I was getting somewhat of a good read on what the secondary is looking like. And Jon Sumrall is correct. It is a very young team in the secondary. To me, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but then I went back and looked at all of the rosters over the last 2-3 seasons, if you will, because it really just struck me today more than any other day. Now, I actually looked at Ethan Hudak, shout out Ethan Hudak, long snapper for Tulane, said he's one of the guys that is the few that I can palpably remember from the 2021 season. And there are some more guys actually that are around from that time that I might expect. I was surprised by some of them. Jesus Machado, for example, but he really didn't see the field. He still lived that whole experience. But, you look at some guys like Angelo Anderson, who actually played a little on the defensive line throughout that year. Rashad Green, although he has been hurt. Josh Rumetich at offensive line. He wasn't the starter. for the 22 year until Kane and Ray went down. Then he assumed it, hadn't looked back since, but he was one of those starters in that 21 year. You still have Kai Horton left over from that time. But other than that, it really, I just, look at the wide receiver room, and it's really exciting to look at the potential of these guys. Standing with guys from the previous team, Jaquan Jackson, Lawrence Keys throughout the days, and they can really co-sign that as well. But Mario Williams has looked great. Shaz Preston has looked great. Jalen Griffin today, he was someone that stuck out as well. I pointed out Therese Trainer. I pointed out Sean Nicholas, who really has that size, like Chris Brazel. The team really seems set at wide receiver, but ultimately, is it going to be pedigree that builds this team? Is it going to be culture? Is it going to be coaching? Obviously, these are all buzzwords. They're not, but it can kind of start to feel that way, because obviously there really has to be a mix of those couple things, but some teams end up going on that kind of star value. There was a point where I said this in previous episodes. Jon Sumrall said, you will not play if you don't know the playbook. I don't care if you're on scholarship. I don't care if it's a guy on the scout team. If he knows the plays, he's going on the field. We've seen transfer portal teams work sometimes in this NIL era, and then Tulane played USC in the Cotton Bowl. And to me, that really stuck out as them missing that culture, that identity, and that grit at the end of the game that Tulane had in spades, in tenfold. Now, do they still have that? Does that have to come from somewhere else? Because really, just not a ton of guys that are still around at this point to be able to keep talking about that. And you also don't want to start it to sound like, those kind of get off my lawn energy of the old Tulane days necessarily, where it really hasn't been that much time since the Cotton Bowl. And yet a year in college football is like dog years to me. At this point, but things that really have at least caught my eye throughout these last couple of weeks have just been the tempo. And it's something that everyone pointed out today. Everyone noticed that Jon Sumrall stopped the practice and really pulled these guys in. And he's definitely hard on them. Again, Willie Fritz, a lot of tough love. Spring just did feel a little quieter, but when you have this many questions to solve and you need to form an identity, you need to form a depth chart. They lost 15 starters from the last year. And there were guys that played valuable depth at several different roles, and especially among the offensive line, even though he has pointed to offensive tackle as one of those needs, if you will. A lot of guys have been there since the 2021 year at the offensive line position. I said before, Josh Revetich, Rashad Green, but Caleb Thomas as a backup, Trey Tuggle as a backup, and Trey Tuggle was someone we saw go in several different times last year. Chaudry Hurst is someone that's been really strong, but we didn't see that much of Vincent Murphy today at the center role after seeing a lot of him last week. We saw a little more of Josh Revetich, and no one has really been fantastic at center, to say the least. You also have to think about that in trying to evaluate the quarterback battle. Continue to say the value of Sincere Haynesworth, particularly when Tulane's quarterbacks went down. Kai Horton had a cadence with Sincere Haynesworth, and quite honestly, I would really just kind of be curious to see what this would look like with him here at spring camp, just to have the chance to have the foil of someone that worked with the previous center versus someone that hadn't. But the good thing about that at the same time is it's a complete white slate for both of those guys. But it's the most important position or relationship to me on the field, just because if you can't get the ball off, if you don't get the protection set, nothing really else matters. It doesn't matter how many guys you have at wide receiver. It doesn't matter how great Mekhi Hughes is if that immediate exchange is fumbled. And your defense can't really do anything about that either. It really comes down to the O-line. But while there are a lot of guys that are depth pieces there, you lost the surefire starters, and you're just kind of looking at guys that are a little more on the question mark side rather than the answer side. The reason I went through a lot of these previous teams before was just because I do want to bring mention to the fact that you could say the same thing about all the linebackers going into last year. Jesus Machado, Corey Platt, Tyler Grubbs for that matter. We all thought he looked really good in spring camp, but you just really don't know until the season starts. We thought that the secondary looked really good, but you really have to see that play out in real time. And as we've all said, we knew absolutely nothing about the running back competition. So while there are a lot of things that you kind of have to solve, something to me that at least sticks out as, he's pointed out needs. And I think that there are some holes, there are some concerns, but then there are, to me, concerns and there are curiosities. You can easily veer from one of those into another. But to me, the biggest curiosity on this team is going to be the secondary. He pointed out how young they were at that cornerback role. And as I said before, is candid about the fact that they probably want to add to that. We've seen really that's how Tulane has built their secondary, at least since I've been around, since the transfer portal's been around, has been through those grad transfers, been through those secondary guys. And you can see immediately how much that veteran presence matters when you look at some of the guys that have come in. Jalen Geiger, who has pretty much, again, slotted in, I'd say, comfortably at that spot opposite Bailey Despaney, but Jack Chinchu is certainly keeps giving him a run for his money. And, 3 safety rotation might be what we're looking at there. You have Caleb Bransaw and Chris Rogers swapping for each other at that anchor role. So it's just those 2 cornerback roles. But if you haven't listened to any of my interviews with those guys, I would encourage you, because you can just really see how much football IQ is really required to play that position. It was the position group that I scouted first in the scouting academy. I didn't know this until after the fact. It's typically not advised to start with because it's one of, if not the hardest group to evaluate, just because in order, to get to the secondary, you have to understand how all the layers of the field work. And I don't know, for me, it just happened to click. Now that all said, it speaks to how complex of a game it really is. And you're looking at things in spring camp, like how the quarterback's footwork looks. That is almost just as important as their ability to do film study. But the play speed is really where it all comes together, where you see things that from film, from tendencies, I guess from your instincts, if you will. You have the athletic ability, you have the technique, you've trained yourself, and then you just do the pursuit and get to the ball. It's really putting all those things together. And I'd say, if I look at all those departing defensive backs for Tulane, they were all so complete in all of those facets in the way that they handled themselves on the field. So looking at these new guys, the veteran experience to me was really what made that all the sum of those parts work for those guys. It was also talking with AJ Hampton. He helped out Lance Robinson, Jarius Monroe. All 3 of them were just as important to each other's success on the field as anything else. And all 3 of those guys are gone. And those are really the vocal leaders of the defense. But it speaks to just how complicated of a position and how much tendencies in those small little details and that veteran leadership to have been able to have seen all these things in a game setting, see all these different ways that an offense has been run, seen this route tree before in this type of setting. You really have to be able to see it with your eyes first. And unfortunately, you don't have a preseason in college. So that's a group where young might not be a bad thing. And it very might well be what we end up seeing take the field and be a pleasant surprise. But I don't think it's unfair to have questions about that. I wouldn't necessarily veer it into concern territory yet, but this is kind of where I'm getting to the phase 2 of spring camp, where I think you can see that there are still things that need to be built. You're still looking for what's the identity of this team. You know that they want to be mentally tough. You know that they want to be physical. You want to see those leaders come out. You know that they're building on the success of last year, but they have these aspirations for going on to the college football playoffs this upcoming year. Well, you have to be pretty well-rounded in order to get that done. And while these practices have illuminated quite a bit, I just want to say too, I mean to respond to YouTube comments and then I forget, and then, that video goes away. But I just want to say I have seen comments fairly at that asking me about some of these position groups. And just to be transparent again with you guys, my job is, to me, it is what I make it, but I've made it a very holistic job that, relationships to me are just as important, if not more, than charting down these kind of things every single day. And I just approach the way that I look at these practices so differently than I do, when I went to Saints training camp, for example. But Saturday, the days where we just gotta get to sit back and watch these plays, watch these drives go down the field and see how these guys handle things as a day builds on. And they're not just these truncated periods of switching off between quarterbacks. It'll be curious to see who gets those starting reps, what they do with that. How the running back room, where honestly, it's probably one of the more surefire roles, and good thing because it's probably the least illuminated by these types of things. But I think that's when you'll start to get more answers as to a depth chart. But the second spring portal window opens soon. Teams are definitely not built through the transfer portal at this point in the year, but Tulane has picked up some critical guys at around this point in the juncture. When I just think back over the last couple of seasons and just thinking about last year, Cameron Wire, I think, is someone that came in at that point. Cam Pettislow was someone that didn't come in until the fall camp. It can't be done at every single role. And you really would like to get them in as quickly as possible for those positions. But if he's saying that they need a tackle, then they definitely need a tackle, because if I can say that I have learned anything about this new coaching staff, it's that they really say it like it is. And the confidence in being able to speak so openly about what the perceived weaknesses are, while still being able to speak to so many great strengths about this team. And it's one that everyone can see with their own eyes. It has felt like the engagement is there. The vibes are there. Everyone was talking about the speaker system today and how nice it was to be able to have a conversation on the sideline as media members, because the speakers weren't super loud in our ears. It really is just those little tiny details. And that's what I'm trying to pick up on just as much as I am those depth charts. So I hope that I'm painting as best as a picture I can in the way that my brain knows how to. But I do hear you, and I will try to get some more well-rounded stuff after this Saturday scrimmage. It's easy to hear a promo in the middle of a podcast and think, of course they like this product, they're paid to. Well, if you know me at all, then you know two things. One, I'm truthful, almost to a fault. And two, if I were in it for the money, I would certainly be doing something else. So believe me when I say that I love Blue Oak Barbecue. The food, the drinks, the people, the location, yes, all of that. Blue Oak Barbecue has a great selection of your favorites from the smoker, fantastic sides, as I always say, awesome bar specials each and every week. Go check them out. Blue Oak Barbecue, located at 900 North Carrollton here in New Orleans, or visit them online at blueoakbarbecue.com. And again, if you are in New Orleans and do head over there, I will go over the specials again as the week goes on. Today is a redfish roll special on Fridays. Saturdays, you have your 1/2 jerk chicken. Sunday, you have your full English breakfast, red beans and rice on Monday, as always. There are pimientos rellenos, which is a brisket stuffed pepper on Tuesdays. Wednesdays, you got your brisket Reuben. Thursdays, you got your barbecue baked potato. You truly have a new thing every time that you go over there. And as I said, you always have a great drink to go with it at Blue Oak Barbecue. Honestly, my takeaway more than anything else is just how much fun I've been having and how fun practice has seemed. Yes, it has seemed very serious, and there have been extremely intense, if not really, as I keep saying, just the tempo and intensity is just ramped up tenfold, but the energy, it just has felt right. That's really all that you can ask for at this stage of the juncture. The fact that, there isn't a concrete answer at starting quarterback might not be a bad thing if you look at it from the perspective of both quarterbacks have performed really well through the beginning of spring camp, which is really the camp that I'm inclined to go in. But Saturday, I think you'll get a chance to see what this team is really made of. So when we talk about this time next week, I will have a much more holistic approach on this new era of Green Wave football. But I just got to say, this job every day, it really is just such a blessing to work in sports and have this crazy game be something that I get to break down for you guys.